Hi, in this video we're going to show you how to assemble an Urban Arrow family delivered in 2 boxes. Any differences from the bike that is delivered in 4 boxes will be shown with this symbol. Your Urban Arrow family can be delivered in 2 ways. The bikes are the same. Here you can see the pallet with 2 boxes. The small box contains the rear frame, the handlebar and the steer tube. The big box contains the front frame, the EPP box, the protection tube, the front fork and wheel, the bench and the steering rod. The parts package contains the Urban Arrow family user manual, the Bosch charger and charging cable, tie wraps, a headset cover plate, frame spacer rings, the shoulder padding, a set of pedals and a bell. If you have received the order in 4 boxes, the EPP box and the rear bench both have their own box. In this video, we will always indicate clearly what this means during the various steps in the assembly process. If you have ordered a family with a Gates belt drive, you will also find the kiosk or neon display in the parts package. So, that's what's in the boxes. Now, let's build it. Step 1. The front fork. Remove the front frame from the box in order to prepare the bike for assembly. Set aside the bench, the steering rod, and the front fork and wheel. We will need these parts later. Tighten the bike's kickstand a bit first for optimum stability during assembly. In order to install the fork, first remove the protection tube and EPP box. If you have received the bike in 4 boxes, you do not need to remove the protection tube, since this is delivered separately. When removing the bolts of the protection tube at the front, take account of the black spaces between the front frame and the protection tube. Remove the protection tube, lift up the EPP box, and remove it from the frame. Take the front fork and dismantle the headset. Please note the headset cups are already pressed into the frame. Also, pay close attention to the order of the rings when dismantling the headset. You'll need to reassemble these in the same order later. This is the correct order. The headset compression rings have a conical and a flat side. The conical side at the bottom of the fork is pointed upwards, and the direction of the bearings must correspond with the direction of the compression ring. Take the front fork with the front wheel and place it in the frame. Fit the front fork, the bearings, compression ring, spacer, top cover, headset clamp and the top cap. Prevent play by tightening the top bolt until you feel a bit of resistance. Move the fork back and forth to check this. Check whether the front fork can still turn smoothly, but make sure there is no play in it. After tightening the top bolt, you can tighten both clamp bolts in turn to 6 Nm. When it feels right, move on to the next step. Step 2. Handlebar. Place the rear frame on the workbench and use the supports to balance the bike. Position the rear frame in such a way that you have enough room to guide the steering tube into the frame. Now take the steering tube and fit the bottom compression ring and the bearing. Then gently guide the steering tube upwards through the frame. Be mindful of the top riv nuts. Guide the steering tube past them with your fingers from above, avoiding contact with them. Now fit the top bearing, compression ring, spacer, top cover, and possible black spacer by sliding them over the steering tube. Before mounting the stem with the handlebar on the steering tube, apply some grease on the star nut and the inside of the stem. This prevents creaking in the future. Now we position the stem. Make sure that you don't damage any gear cables or brake hoses when you do this. Check the direction of the steering tube. This is set in the right direction if the mounting point for the steering rod is located on the left-hand side of the bike. You can now tighten the top bolt on the stem until you feel resistance. Tighten the stem's clamp bolt a bit. Do not tighten it too much yet, because you will need some flexibility in it later. The final angle, orientation and torque specifications, which you can find on the stem, are discussed further in Step 6. Step 3. Connecting front and rear frame. Feed the lighting wire and brake hose under the front frame. Make sure that both wire and hose pass under the kickstand. Remove the cover strip on the front of the rear frame and place the brake hose in the designated channel. Remount the cover strip so that the brake hose remains in place between the front and rear frame. Now fit the rubber brake hose guide on top of the frame tube so that the hose cannot kink. Use WD-40 to spray the brake hose guide. On the bottom of the bike, use the tie wraps to hold everything in place. Do not fully tighten them yet, because you will need some flexibility in them later. In some cases, you will need to fill a small gap between the front and rear frame with shims. These fork-shaped shims are easy to insert. To check whether they are needed, tighten the 4 M10 bolts in the frame by hand. Now check whether the shims fit in between. If they fit, use them. If they do not fit, the shims are not needed. When the bike is balanced correctly, you can connect the front and rear frame using the 4 M10 bolts. You need to apply a medium-strength thread locker, Loctite 243, to these bolts. Use the bottom hole and make sure to use a well-fitting Allen key. Please note, when the bolts are almost fully tightened, don't forget to turn the lip of the shims upwards so they are no longer sticking out. In order to create a better fit in the next steps, we recommend that you take the bike off the stand and let it rest on both wheels before fully tightening the M10 bolts. The final step is to tighten the connecting bolts to 26 Nm. Use your torque wrench for this. Step 4. Disc brake. The caliper is already connected to the front fork. Follow these steps to complete installation of the brake. In order to install the brake handle, remove the left handle. Slide the brake around the handlebar, fix it in place and remount the handle. We will now check whether the caliper is correctly positioned. To position the caliper correctly, you can use a rubber band as shown. Tighten the bolts in turn and check whether the disc can spin freely and does not come into contact with the brake pads. Adjust the positioning if there is contact with the brake pads. You're nearly there. Carry on. Step 5. Lighting. All our front lights can be connected as follows. Remove the cover strip from the left bottom side of the rear frame. Remove the motor cable from the tube so that you can easily access the lighting wire. Now use the cable guide tool to pull the lighting wire through the frame connector. Position the tool parallel to the tube and push it forward. Place the lighting wire's connector in the tool. Carefully guide the cable towards the back. If necessary, push a little with your other hand. If necessary, you can grease the wire and the outside of the PVC tip of the cable guide tool a little. Make sure that you do not get any grease on the inside of the PVC tip. Clean the cable guide tool immediately after use. Connect the connectors. Mount the display and check whether the connection works properly by turning the lights on and off a few times. Make sure that the bundle of cables can move unimpeded when steering, and then tighten the tie wraps. Place the lighting wire back in the tube, followed by the motor cable. Finally, put the cover strip back in its original position. Step 6. Steering rod. Pick up the steering rod. Check the function of the linkage hinge. It must turn smoothly, yet a very slight vertical play, less than 0.3 mm, is permitted. If the setting of the linkage hinge does not meet these requirements, please contact the Urban Arrow Service Department or consult the dealer manual for more information about the correct assembly and which tools and thread lock to use. Place the steering rod around the linkage hinge that is already fitted on the bottom of the steering tube. Use the M8 x 60mm bolt with washer on the outside, visible side for this. Place a second washer and nut on the inside and tighten to 4 Nm. We are now going to connect the front. Make sure that the ball joint and lock nut are tightened in the steering rod. A maximum of 1 cm of thread can remain visible. The less thread we see, the better. Now insert the M8 x 45mm bolt through the large washer. Add a spacer and ultimately the ball joint. Take the second spacer and place this over the bolt and in the ball joint before inserting the bolt in the middle hole of the front fork plate. Now adjust the ball joint so that the steering rod can still move freely to the extreme positions and does not touch the frame or mudguard. If it does touch, the ball joint may need to be turned outwards a little further. Once everything is mounted correctly, lock the ball joint in the steering rod with a 17mm wrench, whilst holding the ball joint with an 11mm wrench. Now place the small ring and the lock nut under the front fork plate and tighten it to 16 Nm. Put the front wheel in a straight position. Make sure it stays in position and align the stem in the same direction. Then tighten the stem on the steering tube. The torque settings are specified on the stem. The correct tightening torque for the connection between stem and handlebar can be found here. Step 7. Bench, protection tube and headset cover. Take out the M6 bolts in the rear frame. Also remove the bolts for the bench from the frame. After this, you can start mounting the protection tube. It is now time to mount the EPP box in its permanent place. The protection tube needs to be installed in order to hold the EPP box in place. Place the 4 black spacers between the protection tube and the frame. Use 2 greased M8 bolts to connect the protection tube at the front. Initially, try to leave some space. Do not fully tighten the bolts yet. Before we install the protection tube any further, we will first install the bench. If you need to assemble the bench yourself, you will need a number 4 Allen key for that. Please note the legs of the bench are slightly longer on one side. The high side of the legs must be on the strap side of the bench seat. The strap side will be the front part of the bench after installing it in the box. Place the bench in the bike so that the holes in the legs match the holes on the inside of the frame. Now install the bench with greased M6 bolts and washers, tightening to a torque of 4 to 6 Nm. To complete the installation of the bench, we place the shoulder padding over the straps. Disconnect the fidlock closure and slide the shoulder padding over the straps. We will now finish installing the protection tube. Pro tip: a lashing strap can sometimes simplify the installation and alignment of the protection tube. Make sure you pull the lashing strap downwards and a little bit backwards. This will allow the greased M6 bolts to be screwed in straight without being under any tension. Now tighten them crossways as shown to prevent distortion and slipping of the bolts. You can now go back to the front of the bike and fully tighten the M8 bolts in order to complete installation of the protection tube. To fit the headset cover plate on the box, loosen the two M5 bolts at the front of the frame slightly, just so that the cover plate can fit between them. Align the cover plate with the shape of the box, then tighten the bolts. Step 8. Pedals. Add some assembly paste and use the pedal wrench to finish the job. Make sure to fit the pedals on the correct side. Step 9. Fitting the bell and Bosch settings. Mount the bell so that the customer can easily use it. If the Urban Arrow is equipped with a kiosk or neon display, this is the time to connect it to the bike. If the bike is equipped with the Purion display, this is already mounted on the handlebar. Connect the display to the computer. Use the Bosch dealer software and dongle to carry out updates and adjust the time and language settings if necessary. By default, the first service is set at 500 kilometers, and the language is set to English. Step 10. Handover check. In order to ensure that this Urban Arrow family leaves your store in perfect condition, you must carry out the following final checks before handover. Degrease the brake discs with some brake cleaner and a clean cloth. Then check the alignment of the front and rear brake. The gear cables must have a play of around 1 mm. Spoke tension. Alignment of the speed sensor. Check the path of the brake hose to the back wheel. Make sure that the hose is not touching the wheel or the disc brake. That the P-clips are tight and angled right, so that the brake hose cannot slide through the clips. Frame lock. Chain or belt tension. When installing the battery, you must hear a click to be sure that it is properly secured. Check the bike computer and its functions. The lights. Turn the key and pull the battery backwards to remove it. You can now place it in the charger. Tire pressure and finally, check whether all bolts and nuts are properly tightened. All Newton-meter specifications can be found here. Finally, loosen the bolts on the kickstand so that it folds up easily. Use of the kickstand should feel buttery smooth. After all these checks, make out a good test ride on the bike. That allows you to check your own work. And you can break in the brake pads. You can also use a disc brake bed-in roller machine for this. Verify whether the shifter operates smoothly and the gears work as they should. Give it a final polish, and then this brand new Urban Arrow family bike is good to go.